أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. Before we begin what we would like to discuss today, I would like to make a few points, inshallah, before we get to the discussion we want to have today, inshallah. The first point which I would like to make is I would like to apologize that these discussions in this series was supposed to be released in the first 10 days of Muharram, but due to circumstances which were beyond my control, I couldn't record these discussions and these lectures, and thus we couldn't release them on time in the first 10 days of Muharram. So inshallah, we plan to release it on a weekly basis, inshallah, till the end of Safar, inshallah. That's point number one. Point number two, what we plan to discuss in this series, we're planning to discuss the chronological events of the historical narratives surrounding the key personalities of Karbala. And these are particularly from the personalities from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. So what we intend to do is basically we will be studying the few personalities of Ahlul Bayt, 6 or 7 of them. We will, for example, be taking Hazrat Ali Akbar alayhi salam, and we will be discussing the events related to his maqtal, events related to his martyrdom chronologically. Okay, so we'll start all the way beginning from the 2nd century till date, inshallah. The reason is to be able to see the evolution of this narrative from the 2nd century till the 14th and 15th century, inshallah. Now, the discussion will not be complete, okay? So there's a lot of other books. So there's some books which I have not yet included in my discussion, but I believe what we will be discussing, inshallah, will give us a picture of how this narrative has evolved with time, inshallah. Okay, that's point number 2. Point number 3, it's a disclaimer. These lectures are basically, again, it's intended for those who are interested in academic research and some kind of deeper historical discussions, okay? So if you're looking for a kind of a majlis lecture or something where you just come and take things without going into further research, these are not lectures intended for you, and I would say better not to listen to these lectures, okay? And the reason I'm mentioning this is when I mentioned this topic to some of the brothers in in the seminary, some of the brothers were like, what's the benefit of such kind of discussions? Okay, so what I'm feeling is even in the seminary, still some have not appreciated why we need to discuss and why we need to study the evolution of these historical narratives. So if that's the state of the seminary, then this is the lay people would be even more further into issues. And thus, for those who are interested in further research, these are discussions which might be beneficial for you, inshallah. Now, coming to today's discussion, what we want to discuss. So before I get into what we want to discuss today, this is a question the academics would question themselves whenever you are studying historical books. So even if you're studying hadith, now because the topic is not hadith, so we are not getting into the hadith related issues, but if you're reading historical books, the books of seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of the history of Karbala and Imam Hussein alayhi salam, or other related personalities, this is a question and the academics would question. Are we reading the real history of what transpired then, or are we reading the narrative of the author? Okay, I hope I'm explaining what I want to explain. So this is a question which is being asked. Are we getting the incident the way it happened at that time? Or no, the narrator and the author of the books have somehow mixed their own understanding also within the narrative. The way we face it today, look at what's happening. Look at what's happening in Gaza today. Wallahi, Allah save these people. The more we are going further, the more we are seeing the genocidal regime just going on with its genocide. Wallahi, Allah help these madlumeen all over the world, inshallah. So this is a question you would ask. Look at the whole incident of what's happening in Gaza or some other places in the world. The incident is one, but different media outlets would somehow give the narrative very differently. Okay? So if you look at BBC and CNN, you will get one understanding. If you watch Al Jazeera, you will get another understanding. If you watch Al Arabiya of Abu Dhabi, you will get another understanding. If you watch Press TV of Iran, you'll get another understanding. And the one who is recording inside Gaza also is giving you another different understanding of the same event. Do you get me? So this is a question now scholars and academics are questioning. Now, inshallah, if I get time, Dr. Najm Haider has a beautiful explanation for this and is proposing a solution which, inshallah, if we get time, will subsequently allude to what he has said. Okay? Now, because of this now, okay, the scholars are now saying that we need to have a criteria. Okay, we need to have a proper criteria when it comes to studying historical narratives. Okay, so let me give a statement from one of the very prominent historians of our time, Ayatollah Muhammad Hadi Yusuf al-Agharawi, who I'll quote a lot today. He has his famous encyclopedia on history of Islam, where the first 4 volumes is discussing the history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the 4 remaining volumes is discussing the other 13 infallibles. So in the introduction, on page 32, notice what he says. He says, إِنَّ الدَّارِسَ لِكُتُبِ السِّيرَةِ وَالتَّارِيخِ. Whoever wants to study, whoever wants to research into history and seerah of the Prophet or other personalities, you will find discrepancies. That's what he's trying to show. You will find discrepancies in the narratives which have come to us. So the example he gives is from Al-Khawariq wal-Mu'jizat wa ghayriha min kathirin min al-anba. Okay? So the example he gives is for the supernatural events and the miracles. What he says is ينقص ثم يزيد بزيادة الأزمان. So they decrease at times, that means there's subtractions from the narrative, and sometimes they increase. So with the time, okay, with time going further, you see the narrative even increasing. And that's inshallah you'll see when it comes to Karbala narratives. The earlier sources would give you 2-3 liners, and then by the time you reach the 13th, 14th century, the same narrative now is 3-4 pages to 5 pages, okay, at times. This is how with time you have with the difference, and it increases and decreases. So he says فَقَدِيمُهَا أَقَلُّ رِوَايَةٍ لِلْخَوَارِقِ مِنْ مُتَأَخِّرِهَا. The earlier books contain lesser and fewer accounts of supernatural events compared to later ones. We'll give an example later as we go further. Okay, so the extraordinary events and the supernatural events mentioned in the earlier books are fewer, and as you go further with time, you will see these events just increasing and these narratives only increasing. Okay, thus he then proposes, he says فَلَا بُدَّ لِلْبَاحِثِ. Okay, it's very necessary for anybody who wants to go study history, you come up with a criteria, we come up with a set of rules where you will decipher what is the right and what is the wrong. Okay, this is the point I was trying to make, that because of the discrepancies in the narratives, in the historical narratives, we need to come up with the criteria to be able to distinguish what is right and what is not right. Okay, now I will not go into the criteria, I'm just alluding to some. And it's upon you, and that's why I say these discussions are for those people who are into more research, and they need to come up with their own criteria. So you will see, for example, when you go in the Sunni world, you will notice that the criteria they really focus upon is on the sanad, okay, the chain of narrators. If the chain is good, then they will accept, even if the narration sometimes is very strange, but they will accept it. Okay, and if the chain is not good, they are very strict on the chains. Dr. Najm Haider, as I said, is proposing a theory which inshallah later, for example, we might subsequently allude to that. When you come to the Shias, okay, you will see some of the Shia scholars now coming up with a criteria that the 2nd century till the 7th century. So for example, Sheikh Shahri, he has a famous book, As-Sahih min Maqtal al-Husayn, if I'm not mistaken, where he comes up with this theory that the books from the 2nd century till the 7th century, this is the last book where it includes Luhuf of Sayyid ibn Tawus. These books are considered reliable. After that, they're all problematic books. Okay, some later researchers I found out they are now going till the 10th century. They're saying that we will have to include even Allama Majlisi within the picture. Till the 10th century, we find books which are reliable. After 10th century, we don't find reliable books. Now, there was a scholar I was listening to, a very prominent scholar to the level of a mujtahid, the community also knows him and all whatnot. I don't want to mention his name, but he was proposing a theory which I was surprised with the theory. What will happen is that now with his theory, everything becomes subjective. Okay, so he was proposing that it's okay, as long as you can trust the author, then no problem, take it, even if he's 12th, 13th century later, no problem, take it from him, as long as you trust that author. Now what's the problem with this? This historical narrative now becomes very subjective then. Okay, now Shia will trust one scholar, Sunnis will trust one scholar, Zaydis will trust one scholar, Ibadas will trust. You ask what's the criteria, then they'll say, oh, trust of this scholar. Then we'll not have a truth. What we'll have is subjective understanding of history. But this is something which scholars are also proposing. Okay, so I just wanted to allude to some of these criterions which some of the scholars are proposing. It's upon you to come up with a kind of criteria to be able to decipher, okay, that what is the truth and what is not the truth. Now, what we want to discuss today, inshallah, is why do historical narratives differ? Why do we have variation within historical narratives? Okay, it's the same event. As we go further, you will notice the examples we give. It's the same event narrated by two different authors differently. Okay, sometimes even in hadith you'll find the same thing. You'll find the narration is the same, the narrators are the same, everything is the same. But you look at one book, it will narrate it one way, and the second book will narrate it differently. Okay, now when we come to history, so the question we want to ask is, why do historical narratives differ? Okay, we'll be sticking to history only, and we'll be giving 2-3 reasons. There are further reasons also, but we don't want to get into all those reasonings. I'm giving 2-3 reasons because which are very related to our discussions and subsequent discussions. The first reason, Ayatollah Yusuf al-Gharawi, after discussing the discrepancies, he says one of the biggest reasons for discrepancies in the historical narratives is because of the interference of the caliphs and the kings. Okay, you get me? This is very important to understand and keep in mind, that the interference of the politicians when it comes to these issues. Okay, now in the previous series also I've given an example of a discussion between Mansur Dawaniqi and Imam Malik, and how Mansur was interfering in how Imam Malik should produce his work. Okay, that's something we've discussed earlier. What we want to discuss today is look at the examples when it comes to historical understanding. So Ayatollah Yusuf al-Gharawi, on page 36 in his encyclopedia, he discusses, he says that, notice, these are the famous historians. Ibn Ishaq, today what we have is the rendition of Ibn Ishaq via Ibn Hisham. Yeah? So Ibn Ishaq is considered to be the father of history, especially the seerah of the Prophet. Okay, and then we'll come to the history of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. But the first we're discussing history in general. Notice, Ibn Ishaq, okay, wrote his seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for Mansur Dawaniqi and his son al-Mahdi. Do you see this? Okay, and I'll mention the story also what transpired. Al-Waqidi, okay, who is the teacher of Ibn Sa'd. Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat is considered a very important text within the Sunni world. So they consider Ibn Sa'd's history more reliable than Abu Mikhnaf's rendition of history. Okay, now he wrote his Maghazi, the military expeditions, for Harun al-Rashid and his Wazir Yahya al-Barmaki. Can you see this? Okay, this is where it reaches, that now the interference of the politicians becomes so great. We have two other historians. One of them is Hisham al-Kalbi. Hisham al-Kalbi is a student of Abu Mikhnaf. Okay, so this is where now Karbala also comes in. And then you have another historian by the name of al-Madaini. These are all earlier narrators. Okay, notice what Ayatollah Yusuf al-Gharawi writes. A prominent historian, he is now writing this after so much years of research. Notice he says that Hisham al-Kalbi and al-Madaini didn't write for the Khulafa and the Caliphs, but none of them could oppose the Caliph's views out of the fear of the Caliphs. You get me? So one is writing for the Caliph, the second one can't write anything which would oppose the understanding of the Caliph. And this shows you why our history is the way it is today. And that is why Ayatollah Yusuf al-Gharawi then goes on to say that وَلِذَلِكَ فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَنْطَبِقُ عَلَى مَا كَتَبَهُ مَقَايِسَ الصِّحَّةِ بِدِقَّةٍ. Okay, you will not find accuracy in their accounts also. So leave alone Ibn Ishaq and al-Waqidi, even Hisham al-Kalbi and al-Madaini, you will not find this standards of accuracy being maintained. Okay, now I go further. So I'll give this example. He gives this example in his encyclopedia. He says that Ibn Ishaq was told by Mansur to compile this book for his son. Once he compiles the book of history, he brings it in the presence of Mansur. So Mansur turns back to Ibn Ishaq and says, you made it very lengthy. This book is very long. My son cannot take this whole long book go summarize it. So can you see now? From the actual events, Ibn Ishaq himself summarized. And then as we go later, we'll see Ibn Hisham also summarize this book further. So what do we have today? This is a question, I leave it on you. So they say that Ibn Ishaq summarized and condensed the book, and the original version stayed with Mansur, and that's then the abridged version and the summarized version was then published for the public. As we go further, as I said, Ibn Hisham even summarizes it more. Okay, now what makes it further harder to comprehend is this. This statement is from Az-Zuhri. Zuhri is a famous, the seerah of the Prophet comes from Az-Zuhri. Yeah, he is one of the main narrators of the seerah of the Prophet, and within the Sunni world is considered a great scholar. Within the Shia world, he's a questionable narrator. Some accept him, some don't. Now, Ibn Abdul Barr, in his book, mentions this incident. He mentions the statement of Az-Zuhri. Notice what he says. He says, the kings asked me to write for them. Okay? استكتبني الملوك فأكتبتهم. They asked me to write for them, and I wrote for them. Can you see the statement? Okay? He didn't write for the public. He wrote for them. So he says, the Zuhri continues, he says, فَاسْتَحْيَيْتُ اللَّهِ. I felt ashamed before Allah that I'm writing for the kings and the caliphs, but I'm not writing for others. So then he decided that he will write for the kings and he will write for the others also. Okay? So let's keep the point in mind that do we have history or do we have the narrative of the author? Okay, this was point number one. I will stop here. The interference of the politicians, and something we still see till today. Okay, I don't need to give more examples about that. The second and the third reason are more important for me, and this is going to be very visible as we go up with our discussions. The second reason is the motivation, the purpose of the authors behind writing the whole history of Karbala. Okay, but rather, let me come back to the first point. So we discussed the seerah of the Prophet. Come to Karbala and the narratives of Karbala. So we have a book called Nasikh al-Tawarikh. It's a book very 200 years earlier. So it's a 13th, 14th century book, Islamic Hijrah. Okay. He was called Lisan al-Malik. Okay. He was working in the darbar of the kings, and then he publishes this book, Nasikh al-Tawarikh. Okay. Shows you that even in Karbala also you have some kind of interference of the politicians and all at what. But come to Karbala now, you have the second reason, which is now going to affect Karbala and its history much more. So, the motivations and the purpose behind the authors, okay, what were the motivations and the purpose of the authors in writing their historical books, as well as the genre and the type of book they wrote. So, two things. One, purpose of why they wrote the book. Okay, so a purpose can be to write history. One purpose can be to write a literary book. Okay, so it's like writing a Shakespeare book. He's not focusing on history, but rather focusing on more of literature. Okay, and we have books like that also within the Karbala books also. We have some books which are narrated as storytelling. Okay, so you'll be surprised. Sheikh Rasul Jafariyan also mentions this, that the book of Sayyid ibn Tawus, Luhuf, which is a very famous book, but he calls it a Dastani book, a book which is storytelling. Okay, so it's not a historical book, but it's more of a storytelling book. Okay, some books are imaginative. Okay, so this is the purpose behind. Some purpose had, no, we want to make people cry, as I'll go mention the statements. The purpose is the whole world has been created for crying, thus the book is being authored in those lines. Okay, can you see the intent? And the book then differs. And then you have the type of genre also. Okay, so the genre meaning that some are historical books, some are rijali books, some are storytelling books, some are literary books, okay, literature, some are imaginative books. So you get surprised that sometimes some books are being referred to by some scholars on the pulpit, which are totally imaginative books, and they present it as history. So the author is just imagining things, and that's how he's writing the book. Do you get me? Okay, so let me give you an example, two examples very quickly. One is Rawdat al-Shuhada. Rawdat al-Shuhada is a 10th century book. Mullah Kashifi, he was in the Safavid, near the Safavid period. He writes this book. Look at what Sheikh Rasul Jafariyan writes. Sheikh Rasul Jafariyan has a book on Karbala. I don't know if it's been translated. I think it's been translated in English, but where he discusses these different books also and how it's been written. So it's called Ta'ammuli bi Nahzati Ashura. The page I'm referring to is page number 359. Okay? So notice what he says about Mullah Kashifi. He says, when a Sufi engages in historical research, what perspective will dominate his writing? Do you get me? So Mullah Kashifi was a Sufi. Okay, he now is going to study research on history. What comes out? Now, very strangely, this book has become very famous within Iran. With Iran, a lot of Noha Khan, the way we call them, they use it very regularly, this book. But strangely, I've now realized that even this Muharram, I realized that some of the lectures I was listening to, the scholars refer to this book very often and very regular. Okay, now look at what this book was written for. Okay, and now I don't want to say it's right or wrong, it's fabricated. That's another thing the scholars like Shaykh Mutahari, they really condemn this book. They say it's full of fabrications. Okay, now we don't want to go that far. All what we want to say is that look at the taste with which, the purpose with which it was written, and then you come and understand why do the narratives differ. Okay, so continue with what Sheikh Rasul Jafariyan says. He says, can it be expected that anything other than a mystical view of the world should be presented by Mullah Kashifi? Nothing but a mystical understanding of the whole event of Karbala. Okay, and that is why he goes further by saying that the whole purpose, the whole direction Mullah Kashifi takes his book into is he takes the world So you see, the Sufis consider that the more a person undergoes through afflictions and troubles and torture, the higher the elevated stations he reaches to. You get me? So the more afflictions you go through, the more you reach to the higher levels of spirituality. And this is the idea with which this book is being written. So the more afflictions you show, and this is what Imam was trying to achieve. And that's exactly, he goes further by saying that as far as the martyrs of Karbala are concerned, their status in this world was bad and wretched. So this world is not a place to stay. For a Sufi, this place is not a world to stay. Okay? Thus the martyrs of Karbala wanted to quickly go away from this world. So they took upon them the biggest afflictions, but they wanted to leave this world very quickly. So forming a government, uprising, and this standing up for justice and all doesn't make sense for a Sufi. Do you get me? Okay. Now, this was the role of the martyrs of Karbala. What's our role? He says, as for the devotees of the Imam alayhi salam, the greatest legacy left to us is the act of weeping and crying. All what we need to do is cry and weep. That's all. Okay. Now, when this book is written, you understand what will come out. Let me give you another example. The book called Asrar al-Shahada. Okay, Asrar al-Shahada is again a book which has been criticized by a lot of scholars. But again, you will see Mullah Darbandi's book is being referred a lot. He makes it clear himself. In his introduction, he makes it very clear. Inna Allah khalaqa hadhihi al-khayma. Okay? Allah has created this world, dar al-ahzan. Allah has created this world as a world of grief. For whom? لأجل سيد الشباب الجنان. This world has been created for grieving for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And you'll see these statements coming out from even speakers sometimes, that we have been created for crying, nothing else. Okay, the more you cry, the more you reach your purpose. Okay, this has been put by these kind of scholars. Okay, so all what you need to do is cry, and cry. That's all. Rather, the whole world has been created. Everything, the causes and the means and everything has been directed towards the crying of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Okay, it's with this understanding now. Look at the examples which come. Look at what this book now comes up with. Okay, now there's a small article by Sheikh Bahmanpur. Sheikh Bahmanpur is known within our communities. He has an article called "Why We Should Ban Tatbir and Zanjir in Our Centers." Okay, why we should ban Tatbir and Zanjir in our centers. The reason he's discussing Mullah Darbandi and Asrar al-Shahada under Tatbir and Zanjir is because he believes that Mullah Darbandi was the inventor of the practice of Tatbir in the 19th century. Okay, and he gives his references also. Now look at what he says about Mullah Darbandi, okay, and his Asrar al-Shahada. Because he says his opinion about the grief of Imam Hussein alayhi salam allowed him to include in his book many stories about Karbala which had no basis at all in history. You get me? Because he believed that everything has been created for crying, thus you can do anything to make people cry. Okay, the end justifies the means. Yeah. So look at the examples which have been mentioned in his book, and this is something Sheikh Bahmanpur also mentions. The day of Ashura was 72 hours. Do you get me? Okay, because you want to show the extreme affliction and the extreme crying also. The temperature on the day of Ashura was 70 degrees above normal. Okay, so if you have normal to be what? 25, 30 degrees, then you have 70 degrees above that. How does that work? Allah knows, okay? Now, notice it's making more crying and it's making more supernatural also. Look at the people in the camp of Ibn Sa'd. Okay, so there's a discussion. How many were there? 30,000 is something which is commonly discussed. He goes further by saying there were 1.6 million people in the army of Ibn Sa'd. This is where it goes. Because you want to make people understand and cry and look at the atrocities only. Okay, Imam Hussein killed 330,000, Hazrat Abbas killed 25,000. Do you see where it reaches? Okay, and that is why when Ayatollah Naini was asked about the contents of this book, okay, so it's not only Sheikh Bahmanpur, but also ulama have commented on this book. When he was asked about this book, he says that because the author considered himself a mujtahid, he considered lying to be normal. Okay, so he can see in that capacity he did not see any intrinsic malice in lying, especially if it served some benefit. He regarded lies in his book as a service to religion. Can you see this? So sometimes lies are made to be normal as long as you can achieve the means. The same thing we have in hadith also, yeah? Some hadith were made up when the narrators were asked, why are you making this hadith up? He says, we want people to recite Quran more, and that's why we're making up these ahadith, okay? Or for example, Ayatollah Mutahari says that if you look at the contents of this book, it makes you cry for Islam. Okay, this is where the contents had gone. Okay, now a final point in the second point is this, that Sheikh Rasul Jafarian, let's come back to him. He has a very interesting point, which again strengthens the point which I'm trying to make, that we need to be more vigilant and try and find out what's the actual history from the narrative of the author. Okay, he says, با این حال باید گفت دانش تاریخ از قرن پنجم به این سو ضعیف شد. So what he's claiming is that from the 5th century onwards, the science of history became weak and weaker. Okay, so this is now even before Sayyid ibn Tawus. Sayyid ibn Tawus comes in the 7th century. So he's claiming that the 5th century books became weak in history. Now what comes out of those books? Okay, so notice he says that. He says نتیجه آن پدید آمدن آثاری بود که بیش از آن که تاریخی باشد اثر غیر تاریخی است. So when you look at these books now, as much as they're called a historical book, but they don't look like books of history. They look like books of non-history. So how do they look? So he says they look more of a books like بشكل داستانی, ادبی و روزها. Okay, so he's dividing the genre into these three genres and types of narratives. He's saying some books you will find them, they're very storytelling books. And the example he gives of this is two books. Ibn Atham's Al-Futuh. Al-Futuh of Ibn Atham is 3rd, 4th century book. And Luhuf of Sayyid ibn Tawus, which is considered a very important text within the Shia world. We'll see as we go further, you'll see the examples, what comes out. Okay. Some have become more of a literary books. So they're more focused on the adabi part of it. They're more focused on the eloquence, they're more focused on the literary part of it. Some are roziha, so they're basically eulogies. They're more like nawhas and that kind of understanding. They want to make you more cry rather than a more historical book. Okay, that was the second point. Okay, so the purpose of the author is very important. You will see that whenever you want to get into the research of historical books, just don't read the book. First notice, go read the introduction of the book, on what basis is writing, what is the purpose of writing that book, so you can understand the contents which are coming. Okay, number 3. Now, this is the important point I want to make because this will be very much applicable to the discussions we're having going forward. And that is, authors of these books of history took the liberty to add or subtract from the main source. Okay, they took the liberty as they wished. Whatever they wanted, they added into the books. Whatever they didn't want, they subtracted from the books. Sometimes they summarized the books. Sometimes they deleted some things which they didn't want. Okay, this is the liberty some of the later authors took from the earlier books. Okay, so come again, give you the example of Seerah of the Prophet, and then we come to the Karbala's history. So again, Sheikh Yusuf al-Gharawi, on page 20, he says, عمل ابن هشام في سيرة ابن إسحاق. As we said, Ibn Ishaq was itself summarized. Okay, now look at what is further happening now. So Ibn Hisham, today we don't have Ibn Ishaq's history with us. All what we have is Ibn Hisham's rendition and narrative from Ibn Ishaq's book. Now what did Ibn Ishaq do? Look at what he did. لم يرويها كما هي. Okay, he didn't narrate it. He didn't narrate Ibn Ishaq's history the way it was. What did he do? Rather, he subjected it to significant editing. The word Ayatollah Yusuf al-Gharawi uses, notice what he says. He says, تناولها بكثير. He played around with it a lot. Okay, he made a significant change in the book. Now, what did he do? So, he summarized, number 1. Number 2, he added. So, he added whatever he wanted. Occasionally, he even criticized the contents of the books and he contrasted it with other narrations. Okay. Rather, he went further. He deleted even things which he found objectionable. Now, on what basis did he delete? We don't know. Why do you remove those incidents? Because he subjectively found it objectionable and then he deleted them. Okay. Rather, he says, I deleted also some of the reports which I felt will be distressing for some others. Okay. So if people read them, they'll get distressed. They'll feel like, these are not good reports. He deleted them. Or the reports which were not transmitted by Al-Bakka'i. Okay, now inshallah, if we discuss Seerah of the Prophet, we'll discuss how many narrators were there and all whatnot. Can you see now? It was more of a subjective deletion and subtraction and addition and whatever they wanted to do. Summarize the books. A similar issue we find with Tabaqat of Ibn Sa'd. Okay, so there's a book by a group of scholars who under the supervision of Sheikh Rasul Ja'fariyan. The book's name is Naqd wa Barrasiya Manabir Sirah Nabawi. On page number 140, they discuss Ibn Sa'd's understanding. Ibn Sa'd also did a similar thing what Ibn Hisham did with Ibn Ishaq. So Ibn Sa'd, who is considered an authority within the Sunni world, and you will notice whenever a report is Ibn Sa'd's version, the Sunnis will give it more preference to it. Okay. Now Ibn Sa'd also did the same. He deleted what he wanted, he omitted what he wanted, he summarized what he wanted. This is exactly what he did with Waqid's book, was his teacher. Okay, now I don't want to mention this, the statements, but now the important point is here. These scholars say that this method of omitting narrators, presenting narrations in a summarized manner, reaches its peak in Ibn Athir's Al-Kamil. Ibn Athir is the 6th century. You remember Sheikh Rasul Jafarian's statement, yeah? That 5th, 6th century now, historical science, science of history becomes weak. That's exactly what he's meaning. Now you will see that they're not narrating history, but rather concising and summarizing the historical narratives only. Okay? So by the 6th century, you will notice that everything is now getting summarized. So the actual event now is getting lost somehow, somewhere in the narrative of the author. I want to repeat again. Doesn't mean that everything is fabricated. Rather, what I'm trying to prove is that we need to come up with a criteria of finding out what is the right thing and what is the wrong thing. Okay? Now, look at the example. We'll give an example from the seerah of the Prophet and from Karbala, and I finish. So, Sheikh Atullah Yusuf al-Gharawi gives this example on page 36. He gives this example. Look at the example. He gives the same event, okay, by two different authors, narrated it differently. Okay, one is narrated by Ibn Ishaq. This is mid-2nd century, and the second example he gives is from Sahih Muslim, which is mid-3rd century. Notice, with time, look at how the rendition and the narrative also increases. So, the example is about Tabuk. So the example event is the same event. Okay, as I say, the events are normally the same, but look at the narratives, how they differ. So the Prophet and the companions go to Tabuk. And as you know that the whole Battle of Tabuk was called Jaysh al-Usra, okay, because it was a long journey to undertake, a lot of troubles, a lot of hardships that the Muslims had to undergo. Okay, so Ibn Hisham narrates. This is how much he narrates. He says one day when they wake up, they had no water. Okay, so in the traveling to Tabuk, one day they wake up, they don't have any water to drink because it was a long trip. They didn't think it would take so long and so much hardship, and thus they didn't have enough water. So they come to the Prophet ﷺ and tell him that we don't have water anymore. So Ibn Hisham's narrative, now look at what Ibn Hisham says. Ibn Hisham says that the Prophet supplicated, he made dua to Allah, and Allah sent rain. He sent so much rain that they could not only quench their thirst, but they could fill their vessels with water, and they continue. Here Ibn Hisham finishes his narrative. Look at what now happens in Sahih Muslim. The same narrative, look at how it's mentioned in Sahih Muslim. First of all, it's a longer narrative. He says that Mu'adh bin Jabal narrates. He says that the Prophet told us that tomorrow you will reach Tabuk. You will not drink water until I arrive in Tabuk. Can you see these were not things mentioned in Ibn Hisham's rendition? So he says that you will not drink water until I reach. Now, Mu'adh says that before we reached, we saw already some people had already reached Tabuk already. And there was little water dripping down from the spring. So the Prophet comes to them and tells them, did you drink water from this? Did you touch this water? I told you not to touch this water. And they say, we've already touched this water. So the Prophet rebukes them. Now notice, these are all things not mentioned in the earlier rendition of Ibn Hisham. Can you see this? Okay? Now, so what does he do? The Prophet then tells them, now what you will do is, La ilaha illallah, you will scoop water, drops by drop, okay? You will fill it in your hands and put it in the vessel until the vessel is filled. That's your punishment somehow. You need to fill the water with the small dripping, and then you fill it in the vessel. Now, once the vessel was filled, the Prophet washed his hands and face with it, and then poured the water back into the spring. Now notice, there was no mention of spring in the earlier narration. The earlier narration of Ibn Ishaq was what? That the water came down in a form of rain. Here now, there's a whole supernatural event happening now. There's a miracle happening now. Remember Sheikh Yusuf al-Gharawi's statement, with time the miracles increase. Okay, so what happens now, the Prophet puts the water back and suddenly the spring starts gushing out of water, and then it gave water enough to be able to quench and fill everything for the Muslims. So now the question he asks, Sheikh Yusuf al-Gharawi, he says, did the Muslims quench the thirst with gushing spring or with the rain coming down? Okay, does the first simple account not suffice without the second exaggerated one? Now, these are his statements. Okay, and this is exactly the point I'm trying to make, that the narratives, as you go with time, you will see that the narratives have their own additions and subtractions. Now, come to Karbala. I give examples. There are plenty of examples to give. As we go further, you will see the examples. I would like to give an example from Luhuf. Luhuf is considered one of the very reliable books within the Shia world. We don't question Sayyid ibn Tawus was a very respectable scholar, a very pious scholar. Did he fabricate? No, we don't want to say he fabricated. But this whole issue of the narrative of the author, did it get interfered in his book? This is a question which we need to ask. Okay, so I want to give an example from Sheikh Mufid's narrative. So Sheikh Mufid is 4th, 5th century, and then see the same narrative from Luhuf in the 7th century. Okay, so Sheikh Mufid in his Irshad narrates this from Abdullah bin Ja'far. Now the name is very important. As we go further, you'll see that the name also changes. Okay, there was this feeling within some of the elders in Mecca and Medina that we should not allow Imam Hussein to go towards Kufa. Yeah, you've heard of this. So Abdullah bin Ja'far also feels the same, that we should not allow Imam Hussein to proceed towards Kufa. So somehow he comes to convince the Imam that can you please not go towards Kufa, and you know the type of people in Kufa. So Imam turns back to him and tells him that فَقَالْ, I saw the dream, I saw the Prophet ﷺ in the dream, and he told me to proceed. You get me? Okay? This was the answer of the Imam. So Abdullah bin Ja'far asks, he says, but what is the dream? So Imam says, مَا أَحَدَّثْتُ أَحَدًا بِهَا, I have not told anybody about the dream, and I will not tell anybody about the dream until the day of judgment. That means I will die with the secret of what I saw in the dream. This is Sheikh Mufid's narrative. Okay? Same incident now comes in Luhuf now. In Luhuf, notice how it goes now. The narrator changes, it's Muhammad bin Hanafiya now. So it's not Abdullah bin Ja'far anymore, it's Muhammad bin Hanafiya. So those who are doing research, they have somehow said that probably Sayyid ibn Tawus mixed up the names or whatever. He went to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, convincing him again not to go to Kufa. Okay? So Imam says, even if I stay in Mecca, they will kill me inside Mecca. So Ibn Hanafiya tells him, go to Yemen then, or go somewhere else far. Notice these are things not mentioned in that narrative. Okay? People will give sanctuary to you. You are respected, you are from the family of the Prophet, you will get sanctuary. Now, Imam Hussein turns back to him and tells him that, okay, I will consider what you have said. Now, notice there it was Imam replying that he saw the dream. Here Imam says, I will consider. Somehow Ibn Hanafiya now sees that the Imam is preparing to go. So he comes and asks him, you told me that you will consider that you will go somewhere else. So he said, after you left, I saw the Prophet in the dream. You remember the dream? Irshad of Sheikh Mufid said what? The dream was there, but he didn't tell what he saw in the dream. Okay? Now here, Ibn Hanafiya turns back to Imam and says, can you tell me, what did you see in the dream? Now here is where the narrative changes now. There, the Imam didn't mention the details of the dreams, the content of the dream. Here, you see the dream being mentioned. And it's the first time this incident is being mentioned. Before Sayyid ibn Tawus, nobody has mentioned this statement. And the statement has become so famous within the speakers and within the tongues. Okay? What did Imam say? The Prophet tells Imam Hussein alayhi salam, you go. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ شَاءَ أَن يَرَاكَ قَتِيلًا. This is a famous statement which you'll hear a lot in the lectures. The Prophet tells Imam that Allah wishes to see you as a martyr. You get me? Okay, this was not there in the earlier rendition of and the narrative of Sheikh Mufid. So Ibn Hanafiya turns back and tells the Imam that, okay, what about the women then? So he says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ شَاءَ أَن يَرَاهُنَّ سَبَايَا. Allah wishes to see them as prisoners. You see this? Okay, now this was not there earlier. This comes in this is the state of Luhuf. Okay, now again I'm repeating, I'm not saying these are fabrications, but what I'm trying to say is look at the additions and subtractions. How can we explain that with the same narrative being there earlier? If there's an academic method which can be formed to be able to explain these subtractions and additions, beautiful. But I'm trying to show that the narrative changes. This is the state of Luhuf. Okay, if you go further, what happens? Now, finally, Sayyid ibn Tawus, based on this narration, which nobody earlier than him had narrated, he takes a conclusion which is very particular to him. Can you see this? Okay. Now this is why I say that there is an importance of doing research, because scholars have taken conclusions upon these incidents and these narratives. So, in his Iqbal al-A'mal, this is volume 3, page 91. You see, there's a discussion within the scholars that why did Imam Hussein go to Karbala also? What was the purpose of this whole movement? And there was almost 7 to 8 reasons being given by scholars. Okay, now that's another discussion for some other time. But Sayyid ibn Tawus's opinion is very strange. It's very particular to him. He says it was a taklif of the Imam. Rather, Imam had to get martyred. So it was particular for him, not for us. Okay? This was a mission which he had to accomplish. He had to get martyred to be able to reach to that goal which he had to reach. Then what happens? He uses this hadith to say now, notice the conclusion he takes. He says, إِنَّ أَوَّلَ الْعَشْرِ كَانَ الْحُزْنِ. So the first 10 days now, what do we need to do? We need to be in the state of sorrow and grief. Now, I don't agree with this understanding. I'm just quoting this understanding so that you understand that how these narratives have been affecting the opinions of the scholars also. So he says the first 10 days, you need to cry and lament and weep. Okay, what happens once the 10 days passes? He says, فَلَمَّا قُتِلَ صَلَوَاتُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ دَخَلَ تَحْتَ قَوْلِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. Okay? وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ. So the first 10 days, we are supposed to grieve. After the 10 days, once Imam alayhi salam is martyred with the other shuhada, then the Imam enters under this phrase and this verse of the Quran, that don't consider the shuhada as dead, بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Okay? They are living. So then he goes on further by saying, فَلَمَّا صَارُوا فَرِحِينَ. Okay, because the verse says, فَرِحِينَ بِمَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. They're enjoying and they're rejoicing what Allah is giving them. Okay, so فَلَمَّا صَارُوا فَرِحِينَ بِسَعَادَةِ الشَّهَادَةِ. When Allah gave them that honor of giving them the stage of shahada and the stage of martyrdom, وَجَبَ الْمُشَارِكَةُ لَهُمْ فِي السُّرُورِ بَعْدَ الْقَتْلِ. And now this is something which other scholars don't accept it, but I'm trying to show that what did the narrative do with Sayyid ibn Tawus? Can you see that? He says that now what we are supposed to do, we are supposed to be together with the Imam alayhi salam and the martyrs, because they are rejoicing. Okay, they are enjoying the benefits. We also should start rejoicing with him. So after 10th, you start rejoicing with them. Very different from the understanding we have of 2 months and 8 days today. He is rather after the 10th. When the martyrdom happens, you have to, and I'm repeating again, I don't agree with this opinion, but I'm just trying to say the understanding of scholars like Sayyid ibn Tawus. Why? Because the narrative which he picked up on. Okay? So, in conclusion, what I was discussing today was that, which the scholars in the academia would discuss, that what we have in our hands, is it history the way it happened, or it's the narrative and the rendition of the author which we are reading today. Okay? And then I went on giving 3 reasons as to why historical narratives differ. Okay, one was the interference of the Khulafa, the second was the purpose of the author, and the third was the author is taking the liberty to add and subtract what they want from the main source. Okay, so inshallah we continue. What I'll do in the next discussion is give you a sample case. I want to discuss Ya'juj and Ma'juj, Gog and Magog, the way they call them, to give you an example of how story evolves with time, to give you a Quranic and a Hadithi understanding. And then we will come to Karbala again, where we will pick up on the 5-6 personalities. Okay, so we have Hazrat Qasim and Hazrat Ali Akbar and Hazrat Abbas and Hazrat Ali Asghar and Imam Hussein alayhim salam. We will be discussing their martyrdom and the events related to that chronologically to understand the evolution of this whole concept. Let's pray to Allah to give us the tawfiq to be able to understand the reality the way it is. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.